Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Sandra Loy from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Our team at NREL provides technical assistance to the Department of Energy's Technology Integration Program and our network of more than 75 Clean Cities coalitions located all around the United States. Today, you'll hear about the first Western Smart Plug-in Electric Vehicle Community Partnership, or WestSmart EV project. It spanned from 2017 to 2020 and accelerated adoption of EVs throughout the Intermountain West by developing a large-scale sustainable EV charging infrastructure network with coordinated EV adoption programs. Building on the success, in 2021, Pacific Corp launched WestSmart EVs at scale in 7 states to address regional challenges, including destination highways, underserved regions, urban mobility, freight and port electrification, and community and workplace charging. James Campbell, Pacific Corp's lead on the WestSmart EV and WestSmart EV at Scale projects, will present findings and lessons learned from this work specifically related to corridor charging. Today, we also have Margaret Smith from the Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office, who will say a few words to kick things off. Before we get started, and I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to review a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. All attendees are muted upon entry. However, you will be able to unmute yourself if needed. Please remain muted when you are not speaking. You can also turn your camera on and off if you'd like. You can connect to today's audio through your computer or over a telephone. For best connection, we suggest connecting via a telephone. You can change the layout of your screen by clicking on the View button, which is located in the top right corner of your screen. If you select Gallery, you'll see all attendee videos. In the speaker viewer layout, the speaker will be highlighted on your screen. We will host a Q&A session at the conclusion of James's presentation. We encourage you to submit questions via the chat feature as the presentation is taking place. We will address as many as time allows. You can also use the chat to reach out should you have any technical difficulties for assistance throughout the webinar. Please reach out directly to your host, which include myself, as well as my colleague, Cassandra Solmeisters. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Clean Cities Coalition Network website in the next 7 business days, and may also be used internally. If you speak during the call or use video, you are presumed to consent to recording and use of your voice or image. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers.
Hey, Sandra.
James Campbell. Yeah.
Sorry, Sandra. In the chat, we have some issues with volume, with the sound. It sounds fine on my end, but it sounds like I've heard maybe it's oddly sped up and muffled. Can you maybe hold your phone close to your mouth? I wonder if that would help with the muffling.
Okay. Yep. I'm using.
Yeah, that was
earbuds,
what I was hearing earlier.
Okay.
What they described
I'm sorry
was what
about
I was hearing earlier. So.
Okay. Okay. Let me.
We have kind of mixed results. Some people seem to hear fine, and some it comes through muffled. So thank you, Sandra.
How does this sound? Yeah, no problem. How does this sound?
I think it sounds good to me.
Okay. Okay. All right, we'll try this then. Thank you everyone for your patience. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. James Campbell is the Director of Innovation and Sustainability Policy at Pacific Corp. James joined Pacific Corp in 2007, where he worked on crafting corporate environmental policy and strategy and designed and implemented the company's GHG cap and trade program in California. He has successfully led major pieces of legislation enabling innovative technologies, including most recently the creation of a $50 million EV infrastructure program in Utah. He's led projects on EVs and grid technologies that have been awarded over $15 million from the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to joining Pacific Corp, James was a staff lead for Utah Governor John Huntsman's Renewable Energy Initiative and Blue Ribbon Advisory Council for Climate Change. James earned a bachelor's degree in materials science and engineering, a master's in environmental engineering, and a master's in business administration, all from the University of Utah. Before I pass things over to James, I'd like to introduce Margaret Smith. Margaret Smith is a technology manager in the U.S. Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office. In this role, she provides oversight for a portfolio of projects to ensure consistency with technology integration program goals, including electric vehicle community partner projects. She also provides programmatic direction for the Clean Cities Coalition Network and oversees work performed by DOE national laboratories. Margaret leads energy and environmental justice initiatives at the Vehicle Technologies Office, including the Justice 40 pilot. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. Hopefully my audio is coming through fine. I know we've been having some technical issues. I am very excited for today's webinar, and thank you all very much for joining. For a few years now, the Vehicle Technologies Office has made competitive project awards to deploy electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations in communities across the nation. And the insights and lessons learned from these projects are more relevant now than ever before, as states are preparing for the bipartisan infrastructure law funding to deploy electric vehicles and electric vehicle chargers. James Campbell will talk with us about two DOE-funded projects, one that was awarded in 2016, another that was awarded in 2020. The one awarded in 2016, it's been wrapped up with full project analyses completed, and the more recent one is still actively underway with partners across the Intermountain West. I very much hope that this timely information will benefit states across the nation, and I have very much enjoyed being able to play a role as the DOE headquarters lead for these projects. I will hand it over to James for him to talk about their fantastic work.
Great. Well, thanks, Margaret, and thank you for including me here. I apologize. I'm going to keep my camera off just to help with maybe some of the connections. And but anyway, I'm excited to be here. And this is I think really what we've been doing. As Margaret said, we started back in 2017, and so it's been exciting to see this progression that has really happened. And so I'm going to go ahead and I have a little slide deck here. Hopefully, Margaret, everybody can see this. And
that looks good.
I can see your slides. If you could click hide in that notification, then we won't see that.
Right.
Perfect.
That
thank you.
annoying little box there. Okay. So as mentioned, my name is James Campbell. I'm the Director of Innovation and Sustainability. I am based with Rocky Mountain Power, which is a division of PacifiCorp. Actually, if you kind of look at what we're part of the larger Berkshire Hathaway Energy family. And so PacifiCorp operates in 6 states. We do business as Rocky Mountain Power in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. You can see our service territory kind of in the Intermountain West there in the yellow. And then we also do business as Pacific Power in California, Oregon, and Washington. And then we do have some other sister utilities, NV Energy in Nevada, Mid-American Energy Company in Iowa, and then some gas pipeline transmission, and then also some independent power producers as well, scattered throughout the state or throughout the states that make up our Berkshire Hathaway Energy Renewables group. And we also have a utility in the UK, in Northern England, and a utility also in Canada. So that's the Berkshire Hathaway Energy family. So pretty excited to talk about. And actually what we started doing in Utah, Utah was kind of a really unique opportunity why we began in 2017. And a lot of it was kind of the conditions aligned up. So we really led a lot of the initial activities in Utah to really help inform the rest of the broader organization. And so really that first project what we really based out of Utah was this, the WestSmart EV project that was again awarded January 19th, 2017. And then it went through to the end of October 2020. And really that was this community partnership. Now the reason why we picked Utah was because we had kind of a unique opportunity in the sense of we had very low EV adoption in that state, but there was kind of, it felt like a latent demand. There was a air quality challenge that, and anybody who's ever been to Salt Lake City in the winter, we have an inversion, and so where pollution gets trapped, so we're in a non-attainment status. So there was a pretty big desire to address, from a community standpoint, some of the air quality, and of course there's a lot of discussion about, well, what's the source of air quality, and a lot of people think it's power plants when it wasn't, it was cars. So we really went on this big initiative to develop an electric vehicle infrastructure. We had this concept that if we focused on these different areas, could we help increase EV adoption in this area? Because again, as I said, when we started in 2017, we had very low EV adoption. So we were hoping we can do a series of programs that included electric highways, workplace charging, did some pilots to get fleets to try to adopt, and then some smart mobility solutions that focused on electric buses and transportation network companies. We also had a great group of community partners. And again, this was really funded through the Clean Cities group out of the U.S. Department of Energy, and really appreciate their funding and their support. We also had some other great Clean Cities support, along with some of the universities, University of Utah, Utah State University, some local communities, Salt Lake City, Park City, the Transit Authority, some of these other businesses, along with the Idaho National Laboratory. So that was where we started, where we wanted to focus on these kind of these 6 different tasks, along with the highways, workplace charging, and then smart mobility. But really and then when that completed, we took those lessons learned that we did, and then really starting in 2021, we took the same concept, but now we wanted to do it at scale. It was one thing when we looked at EV adoption. When we started in 2017, we had, I think, 0.2% adoption, and we got it up to 3%. So we went from about 2,000 cars on the road to, by the end of that project, 14,000. So we saw a real significant growth. And this was in a state that did not have a state tax credit, and it was not a ZEV state. So we actually moved from one of the lowest EV adoption levels to probably, I believe it's one of the highest for a state that does not have a tax credit or is not part of a ZEV. So we really saw that infrastructure and community partnerships really can make a big difference. It can really help expand adoption. So what we did in 2021, we saw this good adoption up to these kind of more national averages. But what are the kinds of programs that we need to do to get to that next level at scale? That when we're talking about in 2030, about 30% adoption. It's a lot different when you just talk about 3% versus when you're talking about 30%. So that's what really the next phase of this project is at scale, was the focus on really 5 core focus areas. One was before we tried to create these corridors, these electric highways, primarily along the interstates, but now let's focus on destinations. Where do actually consumers want to go? We also want to focus on underserved regions, expand the urban mobility of electric buses and TNC capabilities. We also wanted to make sure we incorporated freight and port electrification. It's part of this approach that you should not look at any of these areas in isolation, but you really need to take it as an integrated approach where all of these types of issues and areas are connected. So, which is why we wanted to include freight, where we saw a big opportunity there. And then also expanded our kind of community partnerships and community programs and workplaces. And is there things we can do in terms of developing kind of these e-mobility hubs by working with local communities to really help expand that? So we took those lessons learned from, I like to just call it WestSmart 1.0, and now we're in the middle of WestSmart 2.0. And we also expanded the footprint a little bit, not just only focused in Utah, but really the broader Western region outside of California. I mean, part of that logic was California's been doing quite a bit but so were there things we can do with some of the neighboring states, and so we can kind of plug in, connect into what they're doing in California. And a part of the foundation of this WestSmart at Scale was partnering and working with local clean cities coalitions throughout the entire region. So we've developed great partnerships with various and different local clean cities coalitions. So really appreciate that. All right. So really now what we did in WestSmart 1.0. So this is what we first did in 2017, which just does seem like a generation ago in terms of the EV space. You know, this was pre-Model 3 Tesla. This is right. Everyone thought Tesla was going to go under at that time, and so it was kind of interesting. Pre-Electrify America. So this was kind of before a lot of what we see today. And so what we wanted to do was identify where should we develop these EV charging corridors. And so our first step, what we did was we looked at transportation data, and then we also looked at the electric grid. And so fortunately, since the utility was part of this, we knew exactly where all of our infrastructure was, where all of our grid connections were. And so we could really then start developing a map and start taking a data approach to identify where we should actually start installing infrastructure, and where should we do the priorities, and where should we do the timing. And so we really started developing these tools to map that out based off of the grid, and then where we thought some of the consumers would demand. Once we first identified some of that, I mean, a lot of it was really interesting, where a lot of folks would, right, we had an intern, I think, who worked on this first, and he just took a map, and I know this is kind of the approach that some other groups did, was they just took a ruler on the map, drew a line, and then did this, right, 50-mile or 60, 70-mile between each spot. And what we found is that's not the best approach to do it. That you can't, because A, that's not how the infrastructure, the grid is set up, and that's also not how consumers actually would, you know, kind of stop in this robotic sense. So what we really wanted to do was look at, we knew where the infrastructure was, but now we wanted to look at, well, what about the consumer? Where would they want to stop? We started developing really these kind of more power and energy demand models along these corridors, where we were looking at geography, elevation, the geography, where is it that people want to go? Where do they want to stop? And one example would be for example, in the southern part of the state, St. George is on the border with Nevada. That's a kind of a retirement community. There's a lot of visitors that go there. If you just drew the 60, 70 mile to the next stop, there was infrastructure, there was power lines there, but it's not where actually anybody would want to stop. Where they would actually want to stop would be Cedar City, which was only 40 miles away. And so because there's a turnoff to scenic highways. So what we really wanted to do is take that approach of what do consumers want, not kind of hard coding this infrastructure in. And so and then also we wanted to get a sense of, when we were going to start putting in infrastructure, actually can consumers utilize it, right? You don't want to just put a charger in the middle of nowhere, and then all of a sudden now you tell a user, you know, you're good to go, when actually it needs to be connected to something else. There needs to be a network associated with that. So we really started that approach, and really our first deployment, what we did, which was obvious, was I-15, Interstate 15, because that went from Salt Lake City down through the entire state of Utah and into Nevada and into Los Angeles. And so again, this was done, we completed this in 2018. So we predated Electrify America and a lot of others. And what we were kind of nervous, you know, when we started putting these out there, there's that, you know, if you build it, will they come? And we actually found out the answer was yes. That we actually, once we put the infrastructure in there, we actually saw users, and we were able to track the use of the infrastructure by the zip codes of the people using it. And we were finding that once we put it in there, people from Los Angeles, Las Vegas were driving on up into the state. So it really gave us confidence we could really expand the network. And then now we go into the at scale, kind of that phase two. As I mentioned, we did the interstates, but then what about where is it that people want to go to? And so that's where we wanted to focus, not just on interstates, but let's focus on destinations. And so we really were using national parks and recreation areas as this kind of foundation of building out the networks. One of the things we saw was we actually had data on where people were actually driving throughout the state. And what we found, especially with the national parks, was that you're not going to just travel down an interstate like an Interstate 15 and then go from a fork into the national park. And people don't just follow interstates. What we're finding was happening was people, whether they would fly into Las Vegas or fly into Salt Lake City, when they go visit a national park, they would go visit multiple national parks. So it isn't about making sure the infrastructure followed the interstate and then could fork off from there to a national park. We need to make sure consumers could get from park to park without traveling on the interstate, because that's actually how they would do it. They would follow more scenic byways. So that really kind of got us start thinking about where we should start installing and putting this kind of next phase of charging infrastructure. So we worked with NREL, who actually did a really good gap analysis in looking at all of the national parks in the Western United States and in these, again, outside of California, but looking about what are the sorts of gaps we have, what is the sorts of infrastructure we would need. And so what they found is that you can see these little blue dots here. This actually identifies where a lot of these chargers were, which would be candidates where we could fill in, and we would need probably about 100 of these DC fast chargers throughout the region to really support the travel and traffic throughout the region to be able to get to the national parks and recreational areas. And so really appreciate NREL and the work that they did. They use this tool, this EVI Road Trip, which is a fantastic tool, and so which they developed themselves. And so it was really did some excellent work here on identifying where some of these gaps are. So really kind of wanted what we've learned when we combine so far the WestSmart 1.0 and what we've done to date in WestSmart 2.0 is particularly related to corridors, because I know as part of the IIJA and the NEVI program, corridors are a big part of this, but really kind of found some of these issues. And as I'm sure everybody's experiencing today, supply chain matters, and that it mattered in 2018. We were having really difficulty getting into finding sufficient supply chain back then, even to be able to meet it. We also noticed another type of supply chain. I call it the support chain as well, and that's the electricians and the contractors in addition. So that's a whole nother type of supply chain you want to make sure that you really have connected. Also, what we developed, or what we found, was there was really kind of three different ownership models of these. And so that when we finally installed a bunch of these, we really developed these three different models, where I called it the utility ownership or the government. Kind of, they're very similar. One, the utility, at least we're regulated, so we still had some oversight. Or we would work with local municipalities. Those tended to be they're very similar in the sense of, when we installed them, it was more mission-based than developing a business plan or having other different business motives. So it created a different type of experience. But on the flip side, we didn't have a lot of the support infrastructure or services, food, stuff like that. So the utility and government model is a good one, because you got a high level of commitment. They want primarily doing it to support a network, but you don't tend to have the same level of services that you could. There's also the third-party operator, and this is where different entities would come in and they would build out their own network. That was good because they tended to have some knowledge. However, there's some also challenges we saw too, because is this part of some national network, and are they really responsive? There's some other issues like that really kind of get into it. And there's also a challenge too when you're working with the utility, who's the actual account holder and who has the meter, so to speak. And then we also noticed there was some another different ownership models with the independent property. And this is your kind of standalone gas station is interested. And again, they have some motivation, but at the same time, what we found is if you were providing the funding for the chargers and the infrastructure, if they didn't have skin in the game, they tended to leave it alone, especially when it broke. And so that was an important thing, was to make sure that various folks had skin in the game and that are participating. So that, I think the ownership models that we definitely learned on that. Another kind of lessons learned was kind of going back to that notion of you got to put it in where people want to be, where consumers want to go. If you don't, then it's just, you're creating spider nests. It really is important about that. You got to incorporate that into your decision-making process. It's also critical you work with the utility early. There was a network provider was putting in chargers after us, and all of a sudden we get a call and they wanted to put a charger in where Interstate 15 and Interstate 70, they'd already kind of gone down this path and this process. They'd selected location, but they hadn't worked with the utility. And what they didn't realize was there was no three-phase power there. It was all single-phase power. But if they would have kind of reached out a little earlier, that would have saved them quite a bit. We could have told them right away, like, yeah, it's $1 million to run some three-phase power out there. You might want to find a different location. So coordinate and connect with your utility early in the process. The other thing that we found, and I'm sure this is out and everybody hears about this, is the demand charges. So, and this is people quite not understand what a demand charge is. And so I like to think about it as in water. You get like your demand is the water pressure, right? It's kind of your peak uses at any given moment in time. What is the maximum amount? What is that water pressure in a pipe? Where your energy is the total amount of water that kind of flows through there. So if you recoup the costs, most tariffs recoup the cost through your total energy flow. If you recoup that through there, but you get a high amount of demand at one point, but not a lot of flow, it's a challenge to recoup those costs. And so this is a big issue for low utilization. And it's still going to be a big issue because there's still costs on the utility, and there's a philosophical question of should those costs be borne by the utility, which means it's basically borne by all customers. Should low-income people pay for rich people who have EVs to go out and put in infrastructure? There's an interesting debate about that. But one of the things that we decided to do, and I shout out to my Department of Transportation in Utah, the UDOT, which did a great job, and they're installing chargers. They reached out to us early in the process. We worked together, and what we did was really, because of them, we actually created a new tariff or a new schedule. So that way, if you did have a low utilization, we could reduce that demand charge and give you a higher energy charge to really address that. So when you're working with your utilities and you're looking at this issue of low utilization, try to reach out and try to see if they have a special rate or special charge for demand charges. It's still going to be an issue, especially as you're dealing with higher wattage chargers down the road, but there is, I know we have it, and I'm sure other utilities are too, as part of this kind of bridging the gap where we have low utilization until we have high utilization. Once we have high utilization, demand charges are not going to be an issue. It's really only when you have this low utilization. So those are some of the key lessons learned. Also, we in the WestSmart 1.0, one of the things we worked on with some of the smart mobility, we also looked at kind of multiple mobility. Right here, this image on the upper left, that's one of the first electric buses in the country. This is actually in Park City, Utah. They installed a fleet of buses, and I believe it's been the most traveled electric bus fleet in the country. I mean, they've been operating it for quite a while now, and they've really built up quite of expertise on there. And one of the things that we ended up doing, it was almost kind of accidental, but then we realized this makes a lot of sense to do, is at the same location where we put in the electric buses, we also put in some other multimodal solutions like electric bikes, and they put a very successful electric bike program right at that same location. And then we went ahead and installed some DC fast chargers where we utilized actually the transformers that were used for the electric bus. So we could share some of that infrastructure costs and kind of create this kind of hub, this multimodal mobility hub where we have both electric buses, electric bikes, and then access to charging, some fast charging. And actually what we ended up finding was, you would think that, this is Park City, which is an affluent vacation destination. It's actually, this multimodal hub is within 1 mile of Interstate 80, so a corridor. So it was right there. And the other thing that we found, you wouldn't suspect that in Park City, again, an affluent community for electric bikes, for vacationers, that putting this in would actually provide some equity considerations. What actually did, once we put in those DC fast chargers, what we found was TNC users, your Lyfts and your Ubers, that their most profitable run was to go from the airport to Park City. And once we put those fast chargers there at that exit off the freeway, it really enabled a Lyft or an Uber driver who had an EV to pick up customers and take them into Park City, and then they had access to this charging. So who we ended up seeing was using this quite a bit were these TNC users. So that was kind of this equity consideration that you wouldn't really think about normally. But this has been a very successful, really it kind of inspired us for once we started doing the WestSmart 2.0 was to start thinking about co-location of infrastructure. And again, so you can reduce some of those costs. And this kind of goes back to some of those demand charges. How can you reduce some of those demand charges for low utilization? Well, you share that infrastructure, and can you share some of that demand across? So one of the things we're doing in WestSmart 2.0 is we're working with our partners to develop these algorithms to do quite a bit of advanced charging, where we're taking a multi-mobility hub and of electric buses, and we're leveraging it against electric trains that go in there. We have light rail. The electric train comes by, does a big spike and load over a megawatt, and then it goes away. So then we have these gaps. So what we're trying to do is, can we charge electric buses once the electric train goes by? And then can we open it up for TNC or delivery fleets? The reason why we're doing this, we wanted to get away from this image on the left here, which is this kind of traditional, I'd call it gas station charging model, which is you just put a bunch of chargers together and they just stack and everybody uses all at the same time. And that's where you can create this demand charge problem, especially with low utilization. You create the stacking of loads. So this is where we wanted to develop a more nuanced and leverage some artificial intelligence algorithms where we know if a train's coming by, turn down the chargers to the electric bus, and then after the train's gone by, you turn it back up. And so that way you're not creating these large peaks or these large demand. And so this is what kind of the lessons that we learned from Park City, we're now applying it here. And again, this has similar equity considerations. Again, where the bus hub is and these multimodal solutions and co-location is within 1 mile of a designated EV corridor. So one of the things you can start thinking about is, again, taking this integrated approach and thinking long-term and how we can leverage this, and not just put a chargers out there to meet this corridor, but how it can really help advance broader use and increase utilization. Because if you have increased utilization, the system will pay for itself. The challenge is always when you have this low utilization. And so I definitely am a strong supporter of co-location. We're seeing this has been a really successful approach. As I mentioned in WestSmart 1.0, we did some smart mobility. We did a partnership with Lyft where we worked with drivers. We actually tried to get them to work as EV ambassadors. We incentivize them to participate, to fill out some surveys, to really get some insight into how would electric TNC drivers work, and what were some of the charging infrastructure that we would need to do. This right here, this location is actually our building, our headquarters, which is about halfway between downtown and the airport. Again, within 1 mile of a designated corridor. And it was actually our old gas station that we used to service our fleet from like the 60s and 70s. We ended up building a much bigger, newer transport facility, but we had this old building that was just kind of not being used. So we decided to lease it out to Lyft, and that became their headquarters, and put in some electric chargers to support that. So it was a really successful endeavor until COVID hit, and they reorganized, and they ended up closing the office just as you know, as COVID kind of imploded initially TNC. But it's kind of fun to see that TNC has come back. But really before COVID hit, and it's really right before COVID hit, we had all of the drivers download apps. And from those apps, we could actually collect energy and trip data. And so we actually were able to find exactly everywhere where the drivers were going and how much energy they were using. And that really helped inform us where to put in infrastructure. And again, taking this integrated approach of co-location, you can do it within 1 mile of a corridor, and you can also do it where you address some of the social equity issues. Then we also did as part of our kind of urban mobility, our smart mobility, we did a pilot, a car share, an EV car share, where we worked with the Give group, this is an apartment, brand new, all electric building that actually is available for low income. It had a mix of market rates of students and low income housing. But we put in a car share, EV car share. We put in about 30 different level 2 chargers on site to really encourage folks to be where you can live your life completely emissions free, and you could all of your transportation can be supported. And so what we learned initially in 1.0 from there was we actually learned quite a bit in the car share. We just got a really inexpensive EV. We had this kind of older Nissan Leaf that we were able to deploy there. And the battery just really wasn't big enough to support a car share. Is really what we learned was that, and level 2 charging wasn't enough as well. Even though you would think you could have, with the level 2 charging on site, there would be enough support. The other challenge that we had, because what we originally did was you worked with a company where you downloaded an app, just like the scooters, and the app would open up the door and drive the car. And what we ended up finding was the app actually ended up, when it was not operating, it was really using the battery. So you really had to have the battery plugged in all the time. So when it was, the 100-mile range, really wasn't enough to support it. And also one of the big lessons we learned about that is on the ownership model and who's going to have the insurance. That insurance really matters, and you got to kind of address those. So now that as we're doing our kind of relaunch, our 2.0, we got a bigger battery vehicle. We worked a little bit more closely with the app developer. We're also deploying it at other buildings that's owned by the Give group that they're right next to that other building. One of the challenges with that first building was people had already moved in and didn't know about the car share, so we launched the car share after people moved in. So they already had a car, so it became just more of people wanted to do the right thing. Well, now we deployed this at a brand new building that got constructed literally across the street. The car share was available for new people who are moving in. So when they made that decision, they knew right away they could do it. And so we're actually finding a little bit more adoption, a little bit more use of the car share. We're actually seeing refugees who have been moving in low income, where buying a car for them is really a challenge. So they're really taking advantage of this. And so the other thing that we were finding was that we really needed to find a way to put in some fast charging, just so we never have this issue of low batteries and people being stranded because the battery runs out. And the bigger battery vehicle helps, but also I think what we learned is we really need to incorporate some fast charging. And again, the location was within a mile of a designated corridor. So again, the final takeaways of really what we've learned from WestSmart 1.0 and what we've learned to date is you got to think of the consumer. That's really paramount. That you got to have that as you're deploying infrastructure. Really take an integrated approach. Think about this and how can you co-locate? How can you think about the longer term as well? It's one thing to put a charger in, but think about years down the road. The other thing that we learned, especially from the TNC, was that investments in underserved communities actually will drive adoption. In the wealthier communities where there's already EV adoption, putting in infrastructure in the wealthier communities isn't going to drive EV adoption because they have already access to charging, whether that's at home or probably at work. So putting in investments in public infrastructure in underserved communities can really help drive that adoption. And again, going back to that integrated approach, you can probably find locations within a mile of a corridor. So you want to really start taking that. And this can really help with especially that we found with the car share, that how important that is for some people. Getting access can really reduce some of the cost. Like it can really make a big difference in someone's life where maintenance on vehicles can really push someone into homelessness. Where if you have a car, your car breaks down, you have to go get a $500, $600 repair, you go to a payday loan to make that, you don't pay the payday loan, all of a sudden you get these fees. Now you're on the board, now you can't pay rent. All of a sudden this minor car issue is causing homelessness. And so really this can be so finding these solutions in these equity communities, underserved communities can really make a big difference. I'd say the other thing is coordinate with your utility early. Don't hesitate and think big also. Don't just coordinate for one charger at a time. Take a more systemic approach and then communicate with your utility. The other thing is anticipate technology changes. Those first chargers we did in 2017 were 50 kilowatt chargers, and they're basically relics now. So we kind of knew within 5 years you'd probably have to replace them and put in some newer chargers, especially if they're going to be part of the NEVI, we would have to replace them anyway. So anticipate there will be some technology changes, and that's okay, especially when you're kind of being an early mover, or early adopter. It can help spur adoption. But one thing to think about, even if the charger technology change, and who knows if we go to wireless charging or inductive charging, the back-end infrastructure will still be there, and that will last. So that's a good thing. So again, think about when you're putting infrastructure and you're putting these chargers in, even if the charger itself may get ripped out and replaced because the technology changes, the transformer, the conduit, the switch gear, all of that stuff will stay and will last, and you can put the new technology there. So that's it, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
I can
hear you.
Okay, thanks. Just wanted to make sure after the some issues earlier. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll start with those, and then we can take any hand raisers too. So the first question is, does the utility have time of use rates?
Yes, we do. We do have time of use rates. Now, the utility, you got to think, and I think most utilities are this way, but obviously, right, it depends on the jurisdiction they operate in, the regulatory agency, because rates have to be approved by the state commissions. So we do, but if you think about it, we have kind of 3 different types of customers. We have residential customers, we have commercial customers, which is what most chargers would kind of fall under, and then we also have industrial customers. So we do have a time of use rate for both the our residential customers, but we also do have it for our commercial customer. When we did this, we developed, and again, a shout out to Lyle at UDOT for really his insightful and great work that he did. Because of that partnership with the Department of Transportation, we developed this unique tariff that really designed for EV users, and there is a time of use component there as well.
Great, thanks, James. The next one is, do you have the ability to manage the charging? So step down the DC fast charger when the bus is charging.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are developing, that's part of the project, is developing those algorithms to be able to control that. So that will be when we call that aspect of it our intermodal hub, where we will be able to control the chargers on everything. And we end up prioritizing, right? You prioritize the train, then you prioritize the bus, and then you prioritize the other chargers. And so, yes, we do have that control capability to do that. We're still in that testing mode, so I don't have any real data yet. Hopefully, at the end of the project, we'll have a better roadmap. But yeah, that's the key part. So one of the things that we're doing, so I probably should have mentioned this. We have a program in Utah, so Rocky Mountain Power, where we are providing both incentives for like a rebate for chargers, a make ready program, and then we're also going to have some company owned chargers as well, kind of this next phase. And so for those type of chargers to receive any of these incentives, we are requiring all chargers moving forward to be open source and interoperable. And the reason why we did that is because we see the future, and that we know that as we get to this 30, as we start getting to higher levels of adoption, having managed charging is going to be critical to not, overwhelm the cost. Right now, at 3% adoption, it's not an issue. And even at the residential level, we did some studies where we can handle about 50% level adoption in our residential areas without having major impacts. But that's going to be a little bit different when you're talking about public fast charging, and especially if you're talking about fleets and trucks, heavy duty trucks, or megawatt chargers, stuff like that. So we see the future managed charging is going to be part of that future. So what we wanted to make sure is, as we're deploying infrastructure now, we don't just have wasted chargers. So we want to prepare for some form of managed charging and demand response in the future, even though we don't, outside of this test pilot, we don't have it yet for everybody, but we see that future. So that's why we're requiring the equipment to meet these specifications so that we can do a demand response or managed charging in the future.
Great, thank you. We're getting several more questions in the chat now, so I will just keep going down the list. The next question is, how important is the cost of charging, especially for the car share and TNCs?
Yeah, it's incredibly important for TNC drivers. What we found was these drivers would go, they'll drive out of their way if they could find if the city had a free level 2 charger, they'll go wherever they can find free charging. It is pretty amazing. I used to make fun of my parents for driving an extra 30 miles to go to Costco to save 5 cents a gallon, and I see that dynamic happening with some of these chargers. So the cost of the charging is a big, especially for TNC, because it's all driven by economics. And we're going to see that with more fleets and delivery trucks and any kind of fleet operators, where the economics is going to drive the behavior. That's not the case with at least early adopters of kind of our residential customers. There, it's more about convenience. But at least with TNC and fleet operators, cost is going to be the biggest driver. And so the best way to to reduce the cost of public charging, especially public fast charging, is increased utilization or co-location of infrastructure, which is the approach we're taking to try to keep these costs as low as possible.
Thank you. Does zoning play a role in siting a charger?
That is a great question. So that that slide before I talked about in Park City, when we did this, when we had the idea, you know, we put the bus charger in first, and then on the city and the county property right next to it was this library, and where the transformer was, we could share it if we put it on the library. And there's actually, ironically, a DMV office was there as well. So when we went to go do the charger, I actually got this approval from the county supervisor and the county commission and the county manager. Everybody was on board. The utility was on board. And then we went to go do it, and we had the county planning office throw a fit. So here it is. The two biggest barriers to EV, or at least the longest lead items to installing public fast charging, is going to be zoning and planning and your utility. And here we had the county and the utility both on board, and we still ran into these barriers. So just make sure you kind of get out early on that. Ironically, we were going to put, I think we were going to put 3 DC fast chargers, and how we ended up compromising because it wasn't zoned, because it was zoned as a library, not as a transportation hub, even though up above where the bus was, it was. The planning finally relented to 2 fast chargers, because we already had 2 level 2 chargers in the parking lot for the library. So for some reason, 2 fast chargers did not turn it into a fueling center, so it didn't have to be rezoned. So that's how we were actually able to get that project, because we were rushing trying to get it for the Sundance Film Festival. We were going to do a big kind of hooray. We got the governor out there, and so anyway, so it was funny. So zoning does, that does play a role. So again, when you're looking at kind of going back to that co-location, if you can put it in where the buses are, or where it's already zoned for transportation, that can really help speed it up.
Thanks, James. The next question is, how were consumers and communities engaged during the planning process?
So that was where we, as part of our community partnership, we were engaged with lots of community organizations, from Clean Cities coalitions to the cities themselves, to some nonprofit advocacy groups. So what we really tried to do is engage these organizations and then really encourage them to kind of go out into the community. We did hold some public workshops as well when we communicated. So I did think that was an important aspect, is engaging. Now, you're always going to get the one person who wants us to do, the perpetual motion machine and has the great grand idea to do something, and that's part of the process, and that's fine. But I do think engaging is and hosting public events is a good. It was a good thing. And so as I mentioned, Rocky Mountain Power, we have a new program that we did go through a public process as well, where we held some workshops and got feedback from the community. So I do think community engagement is an important aspect.
Great, thank you. A quick reminder for everyone here, this workshop is going until 12:30 Mountain Time, so 2:30 Eastern Time. So we will be on until 12:30, just continuing to go through questions. So the next question actually has to do with Rocky Mountain Power. Is Rocky Mountain Power currently looking for DC fast charging site hosts in your covered area?
So specifically, so we do have, as I mentioned, a make-ready program, and we also provide a rebate, so some incentives. So if there are those that want to put in some fast charging, we do have some incentives to help help with that process. And actually, you can go to our website, and applications for those incentives are on our website. So, so we would encourage is, I think our approach is the more the merrier. If you look at the models of adoption, right, you have two things. You have the initial, you want to put a network out there so you get people to adopt EVs, and then it becomes a self-defeating. Then you need capacity. Do you have enough chargers to support the number of EV adoption? So I don't think we're gonna, even if in the first year we have lots of chargers out there, I don't think we're going to have a problem of having too much charging capacity. I just think in the long term that's not an issue. So if anybody is interested in putting in that, we would, like I said, we have incentives to help with that process.
Thanks, James. The next question is, when you say designed, did you have to create a rate docket with the PSC? If so, how did that affect things?
Yes, we did. We had to work. So our program initially, what we did was we worked with legislators to establish the public policy in the state of Utah. We did this back in 2016 to do our first program, because the challenge was, as a utility, this is not our normal business, and especially the terms of art for utility regulation is, if the utility is going to spend any money on infrastructure equipment, it must be used and useful. It must be least cost, least risk. And so it's a little bit of a challenge to go out and build chargers on a premise of, if you build it, they will come. That it doesn't fit within the regulatory paradigm. So what we did was we worked with some legislators who really wanted, as a policy, to really help promote infrastructure, again, because we had an air quality challenge. So we wanted to go out and put this infrastructure in. So we created the public policy by the legislature to really enable the utility to go out and do this. So once that kind of framework, or that public policy that was established in legislation and statute, we still had to go work with our utility regulators to create the actual details of the program. And so under laws, we can't just charge something. For us to collect money, it has to come from an approved schedule and tariff that's approved by the commission. So we did go through that process. It's a public process where you have interveners, and we could have a 3-hour conversation. Is that a good process? Is it a bad process? It is a process. And so we did have this pretty robust process with interveners and through our commission. And so we did get rates established and approved. Because of that, what we did was, the company-owned chargers, what we're doing, we just went ahead and set a price and got pre-approved. In essence, the price set. And then in a couple of years, we're going to put it out there, and then we're going to see how it works. And then eventually the goal is to move us to set a price that's cost of service. So that's the ultimate goal. But we did establish a price. There's a schedule. So we have Schedule 60, and we're collecting from our customers to pay for this infrastructure program through Schedule 198. So and we did go through our commission process to establish those two schedules.
Thank you, James. The next question is, are charging stations a public utility or run like a private business, such as a gas station?
So I think they can do it in multiple ways. And as I mentioned, those three kind of business models or ownership models, where you can have, and this is where it kind of gets interesting, where you talk about public. We're a private company, we're investor-owned utility. So we do invest our own, it gets kind of interesting dynamic when you're talking about, is that a public or is it a private? So we are a private company. But there is that model of having kind of utility owned and I kind of aligned it with the city owned. And so in that model, it's almost more of a public service, at least from the city owned. Although I will say the utility, what we're going to do, it will be a more of a private business type of ownership, I guess, is the best way to put it. I don't really like the gas station model. I actually don't, and I'm going to kind of opine here on a tangent here, but I actually don't think the gas station model is what's going to be in the future, which is kind of why I'm trying to emphasize this point of having interrelationships, co-locating, because I don't see the gas station, especially when most charging is going to occur at home or at work, because the car sits 95% of the time. It's either in a garage or an apartment complex, or it's in a parking lot at work. And the other dynamic is that you can refuel the vehicle at your destination. So because of that, the gas station model, I don't think is what's going to be in the future, where the gas station model is you have to go to a gas station to get your fuel. Whereas electric vehicles, wherever building you're coming from or going to, you can charge. It's just if in between that point A and point B, it's too long or taking too far, then you may have to refuel, right? That's the only scenario where you have to do that. So there'll be a little bit of a transition, but where that in between points where you'll have the public refueling. But I do think also as we get out in that future with autonomous vehicles and fleets, I just think it's going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to just challenge everybody to think about that as we're doing this NEVI, as we're putting in chargers. I think the rules were originally established, and most people kind of think of it as this gas station model. I'm going to challenge you to think a little differently and to think that out in that future, it's going to be different. And clearly the NEVI, this program is going to be kind of a bridge to that future, but we just want to make sure that as we're bridging there, we're kind of going where we want to get to. So I'll challenge you to think about the future and as you're planning now.
Great, thanks. Next question is, what is the typical lifespan of the DC fast charger in WestSmart EV 1.0? How are the new DCFCs different from the earlier version? And then there's
a great question.
Another part to that. So it's how level 2 charging stations will help develop the EV ecosystem. So
great questions. So really what the stuff we did in 2017 and 2018 have to be replaced. So which is kind of a bummer, but so it did not last 5 years. I thought it would last 5 years, but I think some of the early chargers were just not very good, and it's not really any one company EVSE providers. I think all of them were kind of like that, some more than others, but I think for the most part, all of them had some issues. After the newer ones we did in 2019, those are lasting, I think, a little bit longer. I think, and I think credit can be given to Electrify America for kind of making the market a little bit, forcing a little bit bigger. And because the challenge with the chargers at that time, especially 2017 when we started doing this, really 50 kilowatts was the standard, because also you didn't have a car that could do more than 50 kilowatts. The Tesla, but right, they weren't using these plugs, and so they would use a CHAdeMO plug, and that was about it. And so really at the time, that was the technology that was available, and within a couple of years, it got outdated. The good thing is, as I was mentioning, is the infrastructure is still there, so we can easily swap it out and put newer chargers in. So when you're doing this, you want to just make sure that you have your conduit, the wire that you're putting in is actually thick enough and big enough to be able to handle that kind of next gen technology that's coming. So that's just something to think about. but for WestSmart 1.0, we did have the very first ones that we put in aren't operating now. There's a kind of a technology chain, and it was to repair them. It was just the same price to replace them as it was to repair them. So, but the end of the project, the ones that we put in, those are still going strong, and those are a little bit bigger, and I don't even think they'll comply with the NEVI, but they're not as bad. They're pretty good. So, and let's see, the second part of that question was the role of level 2 in an ecosystem. I do think it plays a big role, and you know, the interesting part about level 2s, and this is what we found with our city partners, who we worked and put a lot of level 2 charging, this kind of community charging out at like the city parks and golf courses throughout in Salt Lake City throughout. What we found was it actually cost more to put a network in so they could collect a fee than it cost an electricity cost. That's something to think about with level 2, is if you're not putting in hundreds all at the same location, putting in a network and having to be able to collect a fee, you want to be creative in finding ways to recoup your costs if you want a fee, because those fee costs were pretty expensive. But I do think, kind of my earlier comment, I do think the level 2s are a key part of that ecosystem, because that's going to be the buildings, right? You're going to have your buildings, whether or not that's the residential or the commercial or workplace. I also think there's a role for level 1. I know this could be, this is up for debate, but there's an interesting question of, should an employer provide the charging for their employees? At our place of business, we do provide free charging. That's pretty easy for us to do. And we have partners who do that as well. It's not as expensive, but you're also not talking a lot of vehicles. When you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of vehicles, now that's a potentially different issue. I think if you're an employer, the role you should only think about it not refilling the vehicle completely, but just letting them get home, I think is a strategy to go about that. So anyway, I do think level 2s are a critical part of the ecosystem, whether that's with the business, the residential, or the multifamily buildings as well.
Thank you, James. The next question is, have you explored co-locating with Tesla superchargers?
Tesla is interesting. They are a private network. There's been media reports that they're opening it up, right? And I think they were looking at doing that, whether Norway or the Netherlands. I think they did that initially. So prior to, we were not going to not have it available. Initially, we would not work with just a single vehicle that's only available to a single vehicle. So once it's opened up and it's available to all vehicles, then we would definitely explore that.
Great, thank you. There is a question that's followed by a little bit of a comment here, so I'll just read that. It says, it sounds like for WestSmart EV project, utility was able to provide information on where the power lines and capacity are available on the map and involved in the site location decision process. What is the key to enable such partnership between state, EVSP, utility, and how can we expand this experience at a national level?
Yeah, well, that was because the utility was involved. So it was our information and our data. We did not actually give it to anybody. And there's some standards that would, Homeland Security, we're not going to share and give to just anybody where our transformers are located and all of that kind of stuff. There's some security reasons not to do that. So, but the best way to do that is to worked with, and kind of going back, worked with your utility early in that process and have it be a have it be as a partner. And again, I want to stress that we have great partnerships with our state entities in Utah. Again, the Utah Department of Transportation is a fantastic organization, and we have a very good working relationship. There's definitely a partnership there, same with the Transit Authority. And so I think it's building those types of relationships and partnerships is going to be the key. Now, I think the question said EVSP, and if that's a third-party business, that's going to be an interesting vehicle service provider. Yeah, so if that's a third party, that's going to be an interesting thing of, because we do have the utility, when you get an interconnection, there is a process. And so we're not going to, right, every customer gets treated the same. It gets into a queue. You got to work on that. One of the challenges on that is you can imagine if you have a developer who's already working and building something, they're in line, they got to do the impact studies and stuff like that. You're going to have to get into that line. You're not going to be able to cut so customers will all be treated fairly. So if the EVSP is a customer, that will be a challenge there. The other thing that I do want to comment on this is what we get all the time. I get asked this all the time. If we put chargers over in this location, is there capacity? And it's almost an irrelevant question because it only matters when you're willing to sign a contract and you're willing to get a connection. Because you may ask, and we can do a study and we can say, oh yeah, there's plenty of capacity today, but that could change tomorrow if a new customer comes in and takes that up. So it really, so you can't just hold capacity. It's about whoever's going to sign a contract and commit. So that's an interesting dynamic as well that you're going to have to deal with the utilities, is that it's those who are willing, who are going to do it and sign a contract. But from a planning, and what level is, I mean, there's simple things like I was telling you about, like the 3-phase versus single phase. That's a high level analysis we can do. But if you're wanting to look at very detailed, capacity, do you have to have substation upgrades, stuff like that you need to do an area impact, a load impact study, and that you just have to do it. And that gets done for those who sign contracts, put deposits down, all that kind of stuff. So I don't know how we can bypass that process, but I will say working early with the utility can help speed that process up.
Great, thank you, James. I'm seeing a couple more questions in the chat. We have a good discussion going in there, so thank you to everyone that's dropped links and other comments in there. So the next question is, what is the average cost per charger, or your average cost per charger?
Is that a cost like as a kilowatt hour, like what we're to use the charger, or for installation chargers?
That question was from Dan. Installation and cost of charger.
Yeah, so we're right now, so the phase 1, the WestSmart 1.0, there's actually, I'll point, Rocky Mountain Institute did a really good study, and it's right in line there. It is right there, what we experienced for that. Now, the challenge with WestSmart 1.0 is it's a little dated, right? Right now, for our new program, we actually are about to launch an RFP to answer that question. So, and then there'd be contract terms. So we're going to get, so those numbers will be updated. But I think for what WestSmart 1.0 experienced, that Rocky Mountain Institute analysis was right on. I'll point folks, and that's a good, I would say, a good resource to look at.
Awesome, thank you. Another question is, are you using any storage to cushion the DC fast chargers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're in an urban area, it does not make sense, in my opinion, to do storage because you have a couple of problems. Eventually, you got to replace the storage, and is it just better to put a long-term investment in infrastructure that will last 20 to 40 years, right? And so the issue, and it goes back, I don't think the issue is demand charges, the issue is utilization. So can you find other ways to increase utilization? The other problem you're going to find is if somebody does put storage with a charger, and let's say and I'll just do a simple, we'll say 150 kilowatt even, right? And then you put 50 kilowatts of battery, and you're only doing 100 kilowatts. So that means you sign a contract when you do your interconnection with the utility, you're only going to take 100 kilowatts. If you take more than that, now you're in violation of that contract, and if it causes any kind of problems upstream, like you burn out a transformer or something like that because you actually took more than what you said you were going to, you actually could get stuck with a bill for that. So there's some potential challenges. So if then what happens is you say, okay, I have this 150 kilowatt charger, even though I still have this 50 kilowatt battery here, but because, and what if the battery doesn't work? So I'm going to go ahead and do the interconnection for the 150 kilowatts. You're still going to pay for the 150 kilowatts. You're still paying for it. So I don't know. I personally don't think on-site storage is a good solution for this in urban areas. I think it's more about utilization. It's about leveraging technology to optimize it. I think that's the better solution. Now, if you're in a rural area and it's about, now you're talking, you have to do significant upgrades to substations and stuff like that. That's a different, I think, maybe a different issue for some storage. But I actually don't think storage, especially in our service territory where our electricity prices are so cheap, I don't think do you pay $30,000, $50,000 for a battery so you can save $80 on your power bill a month? It's just what's better off. So is a good question. It's probably better to manage the charging than it is, in my opinion, than it is to put in storage. But it is different, I would say, in rural areas. That's a different dynamic.
Great, thank you. We have excuse me, another question. Can you share your experience to convince utility? Oh, sorry, I heard some feedback there. Can you share your experience to convince utility or other partners to make investment to install DCFC stations when EV population is relatively small? The investment return model may not make sense for the short term.
Yeah, it's an interesting question of who should pay, right? Who should pay for it? Do you spread it around multiple customers? Who's going to use it? We tend to have a philosophy of who should pay for it. Those who, if you use the infrastructure, should you pay for the infrastructure? But now when you're dealing with smaller populations, be able to spread that around. Now, who would it be used by is an interesting question, especially if it's in rural destination type of things, which is part of the reason with our kind of WestSmart 2.0, what we're realizing in some of the satellite towns near some of these destination areas, the populations there were small, so they didn't have the population to support the infrastructure on their own. But who would be using it wasn't necessarily that population, at least initially. It would be those coming from other areas who would use it. So there you could definitely make an argument of, do you share those costs along with others? And so in our program that we got approved by our commission, and the policies I mentioned, established by legislature and approved by our commission, we are putting in a network. We want to ensure that there's sufficient charging throughout the entire state, including rural areas with small populations. So that way, from the higher populated urban areas, they can actually go anywhere in the state, and also does give access to those in some of the rural areas. So that's our approach. We're doing that, but that was a policy decision that was for the most part established by the legislature, and then the rules approved by the commission. So these other utilities would have to get that same kind of decision by really their policy and their regulators.
Thank you, James. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat right now, and we just have a couple minutes left. If there are anyone that wants to raise their hand to ask a question, feel free.
Great, thank you, Cass. Thank you for facilitating the Q&A. Hopefully you can hear me okay. But thank you, everyone. I wanted to thank James especially. That presentation was excellent, and thank you for answering all the questions. And thank you for all the wonderful questions from our attendees. Thank you for hanging in and being patient with us. Some slight technical difficulties, but we do have 4 minutes. I'm not seeing any other questions. I don't know if Margaret, I see your videos coming on. If you had anything else you wanted to say, or if James, you had anything else you wanted to wrap up with, feel free.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
I was just going to say in closing, I'll wrap up. My last comment I'll just say is, really appreciate the Department of Energy and a lot of the forward thinking and the role that the Clean Cities coalitions have played. I mean, I do think that it's a fantastic organization. Really appreciate the support and the partnership, and working together. Developing these partnerships can go a long way instead of trying to do it in isolation. And I do think collaboration is really important. And I appreciate the collaboration that I've received from these groups.
Thank you, James. And I very much appreciate your willingness to present on these projects and to share your insights from these experiences with the larger group. I think this is a very important conversation, and the conversation doesn't end here. The Vehicle Technologies Office will continue to look for ways that we can draw out insights and lessons learned from the projects that we funded, and help that to inform future federal investments in electric vehicle charging stations. I will mention that each year the Vehicle Technologies Office has an annual merit review where a batch of our active projects, our project leaders give presentations about their work. And this year, our annual merit review is in June. I believe it is June 21st and 22nd. It is a hybrid event. So if you are interested in participating from the comfort of your own home without traveling to DC, you can have the option to do that. And our FY20 EV community partner projects, including WestSmart EV at scale, will be presenting at that webinar. So that is another opportunity to hear updates from James and 2 of our other EV community partner projects. And we are kicking off right now a batch of 4 more EV community partner projects, and look forward to seeing those be successful and sharing insights from those projects as well. So please do reach out if you have any additional ideas or questions or things that we can contribute to this conversation. My contact information is on the Clean Cities website, and you can find the, oh, fantastic. Thank you, Sandra, for putting the annual merit review link in the chat. So yeah, stay in touch, definitely partner with your local Clean Cities coalitions, and thank you for your time today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you again to James.
Thank you.
Everyone for participating. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.